This conference will now be recorded.
So in yesterday's session, we were discussing about what is self-managed Kubernetes cluster, what is managed Kubernetes cluster, and how to set up Kubernetes cluster. I hope you guys are able to set up the Kubernetes cluster. Anyone tried setting up the Kubernetes cluster? You guys are successful in setting up the cluster? Okay. Okay, most of the people done. Good. Now we have a cluster. We have a Kubernetes cluster. We just have a Kubernetes cluster up and running, and also we have a pod networking also I mean to say deployed. So within the cluster, if one pod has to communicate with other pod, we need to have a pod networking within the cluster. So we have that pod networking also in the cluster. Now, as I already told, I need a kubectl to communicate with API server. As of now, where do I have a kubectl installed and configured? Did I install in the same machine, in this machine, here itself? Otherwise, if required, can I have a one more server, different server also? Only client machine. But as I already told, since the Kubernetes is initialized on the private IP, even though I have this kube config file, let me go to this machine. Let me go to this master machine. Let me SSH to that machine. If I have this kube config file, if I have this kube, this config file in my local laptop also, will I able to communicate? Let me take this content in this master. That conf file is part of this location. If I have this complete file, make sure you copied completely, otherwise it won't work. Now, even though I'm having this file in my local laptop, now let me go to my local laptop. This is my local laptop. Let's say I have a I mean to say I have a kubectl installed. Guys, if required, as I already told, will you able to install kubectl in any system, whether it's a Linux, whether it's a Mac, whether it's a Windows also? You can install kubectl. You can install kubectl in Windows or Mac or Linux. Now, I am using MacBook. I already have a kubectl installed. I followed these instructions. I have installed kubectl. If you see, this is my local laptop. So do I have a kubectl here? Sorry, one second. I'm just verifying. Do I have a kubectl in my laptop? Yes. But if I just have a kubectl, does it mean will I able to communicate with my cluster? No. So what file this is expecting? What file this kubectl is expecting? It is expecting some kubeconfig file. That kubeconfig file should be in which directory? Since I am using MacBook, does all these commands works in the Mac like Linux commands? Yes. But if you are using Windows, do you need to have this .cube folder in your Windows home directory? You can go to something like this. You can go to your Windows that Explorer. You can go to your user home directory. This way, you can go to your user home directory. You need to create one folder called a .cube hidden folder. Now I am doing like this. I'm having a cube folder. I'm going to create a cube folder in my user home directory. Now, within that .cube folder in my user home directory, Can I create a config file? And I'm making this config file, I'm pasting this config file, this content of the config file from the master. I'm copying this content, I'm pasting that here. Let me save this. Now, even though I have a kube config file now, when I'm executing kubectl get nodes, now I will get a different error. What is the problem now? Let's see. I'm going to get kind of a timeout error now, connection timeout. Why connection timeout? Why my laptop from my system, why I am not able to reach the API server? Is it anything to do with Kubernetes concept here? It's a issue with what? It's a issue with network. It's a issue with network. Even though I open that 6443, the API server port, for every this API server is running in the master. Even though I go here, even though I open that API server port, on which port API server is running, let me go to that security group. Let me go to the security group. Let me go to inbound rules. Let me go to inbound rules. Even though I open that 6443 for everywhere, still will I able to reach? Still will I able to reach? Just to make it simple, I am going to definitely get a connection timeout. Just to make it simple, if you see the kube config file, is this the API server? Is the API server is running on this server, this IP on this port? Now, just to make it simple, can I do the ping, telnet or curl with -v, the telnet from my laptop? This is nothing to do with the Kubernetes now. Am I checking whether I am able to reach this IP on this port from my laptop? If I am able to reach, then will I able to communicate with API server? Now, why this is not happening? Even though I have opened the port, because this is a private IP. Will I able to reach private IPs? Will I able to reach private IPs from internet, from a different networks? No. Now, sometimes these type of things you already observed in your office environment. Some applications you will be able to access, or some clusters you will be able to access if you are in office network. Same office laptop you come and connect to you in your home, your home network. It won't work. In that case, are you going to use some concept of VPN? If you have a VPN servers in that network and you connected to VPN from your laptop, then your laptop also will be part of the same network where other servers are running, other clusters are running via VPN. Yes, then you can access. This is nothing to do with Kubernetes. It is networking concept. Do you need to be familiar with networking concepts also as a DevOps engineer, like basic networking concepts, like what is public subnet, what is private subnet, what is VPN, what is NAT, all these things? Yes. Now, but how come I am able to access that cluster from this machine? Because is it part of same cluster? I mean to say same network also, this machine. Let me connect to that. Let me connect to that server again. Let me connect to that server, this server. Now here I have a kubectl, I have a kubeconfig file. So here, if I am executing kubectl get nodes, am I able to reach that API server? Kind of a same machine only, kind of a same machine only, kind of a same machine. That is again same machine, but I am not in a different machine. 172.31.3.215, on which port that is running API server. Now, am I able to reach? Do we have a network connectivity? Yes. As I already told, not only just network, any request goes to API server, is it going to perform some kind of authentication and authorization before it is processing this request? Is it going to do some kind of authentication and authorization? So where that information is there? As of now, in kubeconfig file, do you have some other sections also here? Cluster information. It has three sections. That kubeconfig file has three sections. One is clusters information, and another one is context, to which Kubernetes it is pointing, and users. So is that kubectl is going to pass this user information to the API server for authentication and authorization? As of now, it is using certificate based authentication. As of now, it is using certificate based authentication, X509 certificates. So these certificates is issued by the Kubernetes itself. These certificates is issued by the Kubernetes itself. So when the client is sending these certificates, does Kubernetes will trust these certificates and allow authentication? It is going to trust these certificates and allow the authentication. And this is admin certificates. Since this is admin certificate, does this guy can do anything in Kubernetes? Because this is kind of admin user, admin certificate. Does this guy can do anything in Kubernetes? Any operation in Kubernetes? Yes. Now, if I have this kubeconfig file in another system also, completely different system, that can be your Jenkins server. That can be your Jenkins server. Let's say I have some Jenkins server. Let's say I have some Jenkins server. In this Jenkins server, if I install kubectl, if I have that kubeconfig file, does Jenkins server also will be able to communicate with Kubernetes for deploying automatically using pipelines also if required? Let's say this is my Jenkins server. Let's say this is my Jenkins server. Let me start this server, or any other server, or any other server. Is this server is also part of same network where I have my cluster? If you see this server networking, this server is in this VPC. And also, do I have this Kubernetes cluster also in a same VPC, same network? But even though your CI/CD tools, your Jenkins servers is in a different VPC, my dev cluster is in different VPC, production cluster in different VPC. In that case, if my Jenkins wants to connect with this cluster, even though they are in different VPC, what concept I can use in AWS networking so that still I can communicate even though that is in different VPC? VPC peering. VPC peering. Now, let me connect to this server. Just to give an example, let me connect to this server. This is kind of a Jenkins server. 1 second. Still that server is not ready. Let me connect to that server now. Let's consider this is your Jenkins server. Is it part of the cluster? Is it part of the cluster? No. Cluster. I am saying cluster. Is it part of the cluster? Is that server is part of the cluster? No. Now, here, if required, can I install kubectl as whatever user? Let's say you want to, your Jenkins will run as a which user, guys? Your Jenkins pipelines will be executed as a which user? Jenkins user. But If I configure kubectl, sorry, if I configure the kubeconfig file as a Ubuntu user in this system, again, does Jenkins pipelines will be able to communicate with your Kubernetes cluster? Again, if I configure kubeconfig file here as a Ubuntu user, no. Do you need to switch to the Jenkins user and do that? Installing kubectl and configuring kubectl. Otherwise, you can use some plugins also. If you don't want to install software manually, can I do the same thing using plugins? Can I install some plugin kind of a Kubernetes plugin where I can use that plugin to do that deployment by providing that kubeconfig file also? Yes. Now let me show that here I don't have a kubectl software. As of now, kubectl is not there. As a Ubuntu user, let me demonstrate. That doesn't matter now. Can I install kubectl in any server as I already told? Now can I install kubectl in Linux, Windows, wherever? Now I'll install kubectl in Linux. I'll just follow these instructions. I'll download that kubectl binary is downloaded. Now I'll execute this command which will install that kubectl into user local bin. Then do I have a kubectl now in this machine? Yeah, but again, will it work if you do like this? No. Do I need to configure that kube config here? If I don't have already, if I have not done already, I'll create a folder like this .cube in the current user home directory. mkdir.cube. Now can I create a kube config file? But is that file is part of this server? It is not part of this server. Can I get from this location in this server in the admin conf file? You can SCP from this machine, or you can just cat the content of this file and have that in this server. Now, this is also part of same network. And did I open all the ports? I mean to say all port for that range also, even though I don't do this in this machine, even though I don't do this, this 0.0.06443, did I already done that for this range 172.31.0.0/16? Is my Jenkins server is also part of that range? If you see the Jenkins server private IP, is that is also that range? Your Jenkins server private IP, if you see, is it in that range 172.31.45.39? Because same network. Now, even though it is a private IP, this time is it able to communicate with that cluster API server? Now, is this machine is part of the Kubernetes? Is it part of the cluster? Is it a master or is it a worker? No. But still, will I able to deploy my applications from here? Will I able to communicate and deploy my applications from here? Is everyone clear what is kubectl, that client, how it works? People are getting confused lot of times. Do I need to mandatorily install kubectl in the master? Do I need to have a kubectl always in the master? Not required. That can be in any machine, even in your local laptop also. Even in your local laptop also. Your cluster is running somewhere else. Your cluster is running in AWS or your own data center. Will you able to communicate with your cluster using kubectl from your laptop if you have a network and authentication, authorization? Yes. Is everyone clear what is kubectl? Just instead of creating a one more machine, I just created I installed kubectl in the same machine. Is everyone clear what is kubectl? Now, as of now, let me close this. I don't want to confuse more, so I'll close this. I am using same machine, that is my master machine. In this machine, I already configured kubectl. If you see this machine, is it nothing but your master machine? Because I have installed kubectl in the same machine, that is your master machine. As of now, we just have a cluster. Did I deploy any application in the cluster as of now? No. Now come to the deployment. Coming to the deployment, before I deploy, we need to understand some Kubernetes concepts. When we are using Docker Swarm, how we are deploying our images, our Docker images or container images, how we are creating, what we are creating to deploy this one? Are we creating a services in Docker Swarm? The service is creating containers internally, creating and managing containers. But now in Kubernetes, can I directly deploy this container as is the way we are deploying in the Docker Swarm? No. So in the Docker Swarm, you have a concepts like service. In the Docker Swarm, you have a concept like service, stack, containers, right? In Kubernetes, you have, we call it as a Kubernetes objects or resources or APIs or workloads, all are same. All are same. One second. In Kubernetes, we have a concept called objects, resources, APIs or workloads, all are same. The way we have a container, services, stacks in Docker Swarm, in Kubernetes we have some concepts. So in Kubernetes you have some concepts, or Kubernetes resources we call it, something like this: replication controllers, replica sets, daemon sets, deployments, stateful set. The way we have here volumes, right? Here also we have some concept called persistent, excuse me, persistent volumes, persistent volume claims, config maps, secrets, storage class. Like this, you have some concepts here. Like this, you have some concepts here. Now, if I want to deploy any application, I mean to say any image, basically application is nothing but your image, container image, right? You are trying to deploy your application as a container. Do you need to make sure you have an image created for that application with required softwares and application code? Yes. So if you want to deploy your application image, that is your Docker image, here as a which Kubernetes resource you want to deploy, what is the smallest building block or basic unit of scheduling in Kubernetes? What is the small object or small resource which you can create in Kubernetes is pod. Pod. Will I able to directly create and manage the containers in Kubernetes? No. So even though I want to create a containers and manage the containers, that container has to be wrapped it under what? That container has to be created or wrapped it under what? With the help of pod. With the help of pod. So we have some concepts here. Pod. This is the smallest building block or basic unit of scheduling. Before I explain this pod, let me explain one more important concept called a namespace. Namespace. Don't get confused this namespace with Linux namespace, whatever I was explaining. Whatever I was explaining in the Docker, right? I was saying containers will be using namespaces and C groups concept in the Linux kernel, that namespace is different. This Kubernetes namespace is different. What is this namespace, right? It's this Kubernetes namespace is a logical grouping of your Kubernetes cluster. Let's say multiple teams are using same Kubernetes cluster. I want to segregate, I want to isolate one team Kubernetes related resources like pods, deployment services from other team Kubernetes resources like other team pods, deployment services, and all these things I want to isolate from other teams. I don't want to mess up in the same cluster. Multiple teams are using the same Kubernetes cluster. Multiple projects or multiple microservices are deployed in the same Kubernetes cluster. Do I need some kind of a logical isolation of one application or one team Kubernetes resources with another application or another team Kubernetes resources? Just to make it simple, let me relate this one with your home. So you have your home, right? You have some place, you have your home. This is your home. Now, is this home will be shared with all of your family members, like your brother, sister, parents? Now, I need some kind of a isolation or security. I need some kind of isolation or security or privacy, whatever you call it. Now, can I break this home into logical pieces like multiple rooms, or areas? This is your home. Let's say the underlying infrastructure is same. The underlying infrastructure is same, which means this is your home. Within this home, your home is shared with multiple people. Or make it more simple, let's say paying guest. Nowadays in Bangalore, Hyderabad, most of the people stay in paying guest, right? So that building is common. Will it be shared with multiple members there from a different locations, different states, even countries? So how that paying guests are isolated from others? Are they logically having, I mean to say physical, they're physically having some walls? Are they breaking that into multiple small sections so that this guy this guy is isolated from other guy? This guy is isolated from other guy. Now let's say I have a Kubernetes cluster. Let's say this is my Kubernetes cluster. Lot of teams are working on this one. Let's say we are working on one e-commerce project. So let's take this as an example. E-commerce project, and they are following microservice architecture. They may have a microservice called products inventory. They may have a microservices called payments. They may have a microservices called orders, like this. And lot of teams are working in these microservices. Let's say team, just to give an example, team A is working on these microservices, team B is working on this microservice, team C is working on this microservice. Now they are creating some images to deploy this application, these microservices in this cluster. Now, can I mess up like this without logical boundary in the cluster? If I mess up like this, is it easy to manage your cluster and resources in the cluster? Let's say this is your products related pod or deployment. I'm creating all these payments microservices related Kubernetes objects like a pods or deployments and secrets and config maps, and I am creating a order related application microservices related pods deployment. Do I need to have some kind of a cleaner approach for better organizing and managing these resources in the cluster? Do I need to have some better way to manage and organize these resources logically? I need to isolate. So to logically break this virtual, this Kubernetes clusters, Can I use a concept of namespace in my Kubernetes to logically break this Kubernetes cluster? Can I use a concept of namespaces here? Kubernetes namespace? Yes. Before I deploy any application, I can create a namespaces. If you see by default how many namespaces we have, nodes is different, nodes are different, namespaces is different. Node is nothing but what? Node is nothing but what? Node is nothing but your server, the hardware, the server. Now, namespace is different. NS in the short form, full form, namespaces. Namespaces. By default, how many namespaces are there already in this cluster? Kind of a logical boundaries. Logical boundaries. By default, already we have 4 namespaces. 4 namespaces. Now, if you see kubectl get all, what is the meaning of all here? All the Kubernetes resources. Can I call these things as a Kubernetes resources like pods, services, deployments, daemon sets, stateful sets? Now, I'm trying to get all the Kubernetes resources. By default, it is pointing to which namespace? This kubectl is pointing to that cluster. Within that cluster, which namespace by default it will point? By default, it will point to this namespace. By default, it will point to that namespace. As of now, do I have any Kubernetes resources like a pods, deployments, daemon set, stateful set, other than this only one service in that namespace? No. Now, if you see, if I say something like this, kubectl get all -n, what is this -n stands for in the short form? Or I can say full name like this, -, namespace, like this also I can give, -namespace, or in the short form -n. If you see, do we already have some Kubernetes API, I mean to say resources or objects created already in this namespace? In this kube system namespace, do I already have some pods? Do I already have some service? Do I already have some daemon sets, deployments, replica sets like this? These Kubernetes resources or objects. We already have something in this kube system namespace. So if you observe, what are these things? Is this objects or Kubernetes resources is belongs to Kubernetes system itself? Do you have Kubernetes system related pods like a API server pod, kube proxy pod, scheduler pod, core DNS pod? Do I have a deployment to manage that core DNS pod? Do I have a daemon sets to manage this ViewNet pods, kube proxy pods? So do we have already few Kubernetes resources or objects created in this namespace? So this namespace is used for what purpose? They have already logically segregated these objects from other Kubernetes resources. So this is related to Kubernetes system itself. Is it recommended to deploy our own application pods or deployments or services in this namespace, in the kube system namespace? Is it recommended to deploy our own application pods, deployments, services, daemon sets in this namespace? No. This is for isolation. Does they already isolated Kubernetes system related components into separate namespace? Yes. Namespace is different, node is different. Now, is these parts are created in whatever nodes I have? Even though these are running in created in this namespace, does all these parts are running in these names, these nodes, whatever nodes I have in this cluster? If you see, I have 3 nodes. Now, whatever parts I have, is those parts are created in any of these nodes in the cluster? Let me show you. If you see, these are the nodes I have in this cluster. These are the parts created in that namespace. Is that parts are created in those nodes like some parts are in 215, some parts are in 101, some parts are in 70. Is those pods are running in those nodes? For all the namespaces, does the underlying nodes will be common? I mean to say, does all the namespaces will share the same nodes which is part of the cluster? Nodes is common, the servers is common, but within those servers, is it logically, it's a logical grouping. Is it logically segregated into a separate namespace, all these application related pods, deployment services? Yes. So we have a concept called namespace. In the interview also they'll ask, what is namespace in Kubernetes? Why do we need namespace in Kubernetes? So namespace is like a virtual cluster within your Kubernetes cluster. Can I call that as a virtual cluster? Virtual, kind of a logical cluster within the Kubernetes cluster. So this namespace is called as a virtual cluster within the Kubernetes cluster. So we have a namespace concept first. As I already explained first here itself, in Kubernetes, we have a lot of Kubernetes objects or resources. Kubernetes object is basically Kubernetes APIs. Can I call pod is also an API? Can I call deployment is also an API or object or resource or service? So this Kubernetes object is nothing but one API. Kubernetes objects are persisted entities in the Kubernetes system. Does Kubernetes will use these objects or APIs to represent the state of your cluster? Does Kubernetes will use these objects or entities basically to represent the state of your cluster? Does all these things make a cluster? Pod represents something in the cluster. Replication controller represents something in the cluster. Deployment represents something in the cluster. So all these are Kubernetes resources or object. Kubernetes object is record of intent. Once I create this object, once I create a pod or once I create a deployment or replication controller, does Kubernetes will consistently make sure that object exists in the cluster? If I create a deployment, does Kubernetes will make sure the deployment exists in the cluster? If I create a service, does Kubernetes will make sure that service exists in the cluster? Yes. Now, to work with these Kubernetes objects or resources, whether you want to create or modify or delete, you need to use Kubernetes API. You need to use Kubernetes API. I need to communicate with Kubernetes API. So how can I communicate with my Kubernetes API? Can I use the CLI, command line interface also? Command line interface to communicate with my APIs, to create, delete, all these things. There are more than this also. Can I use kubectl, that command line interface, to create or update or delete any of these things, any Kubernetes resources or objects? Guys, to make it simple, you have AWS. In AWS also we have like AWS services like EC2, ELB, auto scaling groups, VPC. If you want to manage AWS resources, create or update or delete AWS resources, are you communicating with AWS using API or GUI or CLI like that? Similarly, in my Kubernetes, I have these APIs, these objects. If I want to create or update or modify or delete these objects, do I need to communicate with API, Kubernetes API? How can I communicate with that API? Can I use CLI, command line interface like kubectl? Not only CLI, can I write some Python code or Java code also? By invoking the APIs, whatever is exposed by Kubernetes, can I programmatically also create and update or delete the pods or deployments, all these objects programmatically also by writing a Python code or Java code also like that? Yes, but that is not required. That is not required. As a DevOps engineer or as a developer, can I use kubectl to communicate with my cluster to update or delete or deploy anything here? Yes. As I already told yesterday itself, even though I am executing a commands like this, in the background, this -v kind of a verbose, this -v kind of a verbose, it will show what is happening in the background. If you see, this verbose starts from till 1, 2, like till 8. Now, if you see, it is printing some logs. If you see, is it making some kind of a API call in the background, even though I'm executing a command? Even though I'm executing a command in the background, is it making some API calls? Is it making one REST API call to this? Is it making some REST API call to this? By passing the required request headers, it is returning 200. This is returning 200 response. Is it internally using that kubeconfig file to make a call to this API server with the required headers authentication? It is responding with 200. This is responded in a JSON format. It has given the data in a JSON format. But in the kubectl, that CLI, is it using this data and displaying my details like this? If you see, even though we are using CLI in the background, is it some programmatic language? Is it some programmatic code? It is making API calls using programmatic code, kind of a Go language. But do we need to learn and understand Go language, and do we need to write this kind of a code? Not required. Now, this is CLI. Now, as I already told, I have one microservice. Let's say I have products microservice, I have orders microservice. If I want to deploy those applications in Kubernetes, I may need to create a deployment, or I may need to create a service for that. I may need to use volumes. I may need to use config maps and secrets. Do I need some kind of a logical isolation within the cluster? If multiple teams, multiple projects are using same Kubernetes cluster, do I need some kind of a logical grouping, logical separation in that cluster? Yes. So to do that, Kubernetes is offering what? Kubernetes is offering what? There is a concept called namespace. There is a concept called namespace. So you can think of namespace as a virtual cluster inside your Kubernetes cluster. You can think of namespace as a virtual cluster inside your Kubernetes cluster. You can have multiple namespaces within the cluster. Can I have n number of namespaces created, even 10, 20, 100 namespaces also? That is just a logical grouping. Does namespace will consume any CPU, any memory, any storage? No. It is like a folders. Just to make it simple, you have your laptop or your desktop, guys, or your home also. I have explained. Let me take another use case. This is your laptop. You have lot of files. You have lot of files, your personal files. You have lot of files like personal files, personal documents, office documents, office documents, or some other documents. All these things you have. How can I logically, or how can I properly organize all these things in my storage? Can I use some kind of a folders concept? Can I logically or isolate folders? Can I apply a permissions on that folder also if required? My personal documents should not be accessed. I can lock that folder if required, like that. Similarly, in Kubernetes, lot of teams are using my cluster. Lot of teams are using my cluster. I want to isolate one team or one application Kubernetes resources from another application Kubernetes resources. Then can I create a namespace and can I deploy in the respective namespaces that a team applications? Yes. So is it possible to have n number of namespaces created in the cluster? In the same cluster, can I create a number of namespaces? Yes. If you just create a namespace, Is it going to take any CPU, any memory from any node? No. That is just a logical name. But within that namespace, if I create a pods, within that namespace, if I create a pods, pod will have a containers. Then does that pod container will take some CPU and memory in whatever node that pod is scheduled? Yes. So namespace is a virtual cluster inside your Kubernetes cluster. You can have a multiple namespaces in a single Kubernetes cluster. And are they logically isolated from each other? The way I have explained, kind of a privacy. What you do in your home, in your room, let's say you are sharing your home with your siblings. Whatever you do in your home, in your room, your private room, does your sibling who is staying next to that your room in a separate room will be able to understand what you are doing within your within your area? No, right? So similarly, I can use this namespace concept. Similarly, I can use this namespace concept to logically isolate others. So does this namespace will help you and your teams to organize, secure, and even performance? Does this namespace will help you and your teams to organize your applications in the Kubernetes? And also, can I apply a security at a namespace level? Namespace level, something like this, guys. Same concept. Guys, if you want to understand any concept, you no need to be very good in technical. If you think logically, general use cases also you can understand. Let's say I already have a namespace. Can I apply a security to this namespace, which means no one can enter this namespace except that respective team members? Except that respective team members, only the objects in this namespace can access. The objects in this namespace can access only by the team who is supposed to use this namespace. Does other team who is working in a different application, different namespace, can I restrict them to create, update, delete the Kubernetes objects in this namespace? Can I apply a security at a namespace level? Just to make it simple, if you lock your personal bedroom, does your cousin, your sibling will be able to enter your bedroom, your private room? No, right? Only you are eligible. Similarly, if I have a namespaces created, now I am going to deploy my applications, that microservices related parts in this namespace. The team who is working in that namespace only will they able to create, update, delete these objects in that namespace. Can I manage the security at namespace level in the cluster? Yes. Now other team, if they try to get also, can I restrict for other team members, other projects to restrict? They don't want to create, update, delete anything here. I can apply a security. So does this namespaces will help me to organize my applications, my cluster more efficiently? Does this namespace will help me to organize the applications or teams more efficiently? I can apply the security. Even performance also. What do you mean by performance? If this cluster is common for everyone, if the cluster is common for all these namespaces, now is your cluster resources is common. Cluster resources in the sense the CPU, memory, storage, all these things are common for all the namespaces in that cluster. Does all the namespaces will use same resources in the cluster? Yes. Now let's consider this use case. You are creating a namespace, but this team, let's say one team A, they are creating lot of pods they are creating, lot of deployments they are creating in that namespace. Does other team will also, so other team also sharing the same resources, same nodes? Does other team will have enough CPU and enough memory to deploy their applications if unnecessarily this team is creating lot of deployments, lot of pods in that namespace? Does other team will have enough resources, enough CPU and memory? No. It is like this. you are having your room, you occupied 75% of your home area. Does other siblings will feel congested because you are want to have more relaxed way? Does other siblings, your parents, your they will run out of the space if you occupied more space? I need more very big room. If you say, does others will feel congested? They will run out of the space. Similarly here, in my Kubernetes cluster, I have namespaces. If one team is deploying lot of pods, lot of containers, lot of pods they are deploying, does other teams will run out of CPU and memory to deploy their pods, their applications? So can I limit that one also? Can I limit that one also? I mean to say, can I allocate how much resources can be utilized by this namespace? Can I say this namespace, in this namespace only 30 pods can be created, or only 10 GB memory can be used in this namespace, or 20 GB memory and 10 CPUs can be used in this namespace? Can I control that one also? Can I apply a resource quota? We call it as a resource quota. Can I set the resource quota for namespace? Kind of a ration quota for you and your family, right? Ration quota. You are eligible for some ration quota. If you go to that store dealer, even though you ask 20 kgs more ration, does that ration dealer will give you? No, right? Based on the quota only you are eligible. So similarly, if I set the resource quota, if I set the resource quota for these namespaces as a Kubernetes admin, does the team can be able to create more than whatever resource quotas I have set? Will they able to provision more than that whatever I have set as an admin? No. So does this namespaces will help me to organize, secure, and manage the resources in the cluster more efficiently? Is everyone clear what is namespace? This is very, very important. Before I deploy any application, you need to understand what is namespace, why we need a namespace, and how it works. Is everyone clear what is namespace? Why do we need namespace, and how what is namespace? Now, by default, you have some namespaces. When I documented, there was only 3 namespaces, but by default, how many namespaces I have in the cluster? In any cluster you create now, how many namespaces you have by default? 4 namespaces. By default, you have 4 namespaces. You have a default namespace. What is this default namespace? While creating these Kubernetes resources, while creating any Kubernetes resource like this, while creating any Kubernetes, whether you are creating a pod, whether you are creating a deployment or config map or secret or value, whenever you are creating any Kubernetes resource, if you are not mentioning the namespace, in which namespace that Kubernetes resource or objects gets created? In the default namespace. Is this namespaces will change based on the Kubernetes cluster which you are creating? Srinivas is asking. No. Now, in my local laptop also yesterday, I created one Minikube cluster. There also I have same namespaces. Now, I already have one more Kubernetes cluster, that is EKS cluster. I was demonstrating EKS to the morning batch, morning 6 o'clock batch. I have a EKS cluster. So I have a kubectl configured for that EKS cluster in a separate machine. In this machine, I have a kubectl configured for that EKS cluster. Now let me show that. Let me go to that machine and show the namespaces. Whatever machine I am connecting, in that machine I configured a kubectl for EKS cluster. For morning batch, I was demonstrating EKS. I am demonstrating EKS. I was explaining EKS for morning batch. Now if you see, I have a kube config file for the EKS cluster. In this, I have a kubectl. It is pointing to a different EK, this cluster, EKS cluster. This is EKS cluster. Now here also I have same set of namespaces by default, but I have created some additionally. If you see, we have a default, we have a kube public, kube system, kube node release. But these two, if you see the dates also, age also, is this created later point of time? I mean to say later. These two I created manually, but by default, do we have these namespaces? Default kube system, node, like that. But this is different cluster, guys. This is different cluster. I already deployed lot of applications in this cluster. I deployed lot of applications already. Some is running in kube system, some parts are running in Ingress, some parts are running in testNS. I will explain that later. But for now, is everyone clear how many namespaces will be there by default? Now, while creating any Kubernetes resource, like pod, replica, set, service, volume, anything, if you don't mention namespace, in which namespace that Kubernetes resource or objects get created? That is created in the default namespace. That is created in the default namespace. So default is the for deployments that have not given any namespace. So kube system, you have one more namespace called kube system. So what is this? This kube system is for all the things relating to Kubernetes system. Whatever is related to that Kubernetes system itself, that API server, scheduler, etcd, kube proxy, vnet, is all those things are created and managed in that kube system namespace. If you see already, when I say kubectl get all the objects in this namespace, am I able to see lot of things are already created, like pods got created, service is there, daemon sets are there in this namespace. This is for Kubernetes system. So any deployments to this namespace will play a dangerous game. Is it recommended to deploy your own applications, other things, your own application related pods, deployments in this namespace? No. Now we have a kube system. It is readable by everyone. This is readable by everyone. Everyone will have access. The name itself is saying public. There is no restrictions on this one. Everyone can access. We are not going to deploy in kube public and this kube node release also. We are not going to deploy our applications in kube public or kube node release also. We can create our own namespace and deploy. But again, in actual application, are you going to deploy all your applications in this default namespace again? No, you are not going to deploy in default namespace. If required, can I create a namespace? Can I create a namespace and then create my applications related Kubernetes objects in that namespace? Yes. So that is about namespace. So namespaces are used for isolation. Due to Corona, everyone is familiar with isolation now. Even I went for isolation last year. In last year, to 2021 May, I was also went for isolation. So this namespaces also, used for isolation. So we can use these namespaces for isolating in a couple of ways. So can I use these namespaces to split my projects, my teams, applications into multiple namespaces? As I already told, like product inventory team is there, payments team is there, orders team is there. They are working on their own applications, microservices. Can I create a separate namespaces for each team or each that application? Can I deploy those applications in that respective namespaces? So it will be logically isolated from other. So is this namespaces will be useful in preventing cross project or cross team contamination, cross project or cross team contamination, which means I can isolate one team from other team even though in the same cluster. I can apply a security, I can set the resources as an admin. Does this namespaces will help Kubernetes administrators to organize secure the cluster more efficiently? Yes. Now, how to see the namespaces? What command we can use? Can I use this command to see the namespaces? Yes. Now, if I want to create a namespace, can I do that using command like this? kubectl create namespace, your namespace name, something like this. But in real time, are you going to have a namespace like test or Balaji or Mithun like that? Here I'm explaining with test. But in the actual clusters, do you have respective team name or application name the way I have explained, like product inventory NS, payments NS, order NS, like that, that respective team names or application names, that application name or microservice name, that meaningful name, microservice name or that application name or the team name as a namespace name? Easy to remember and identify. If I give namespace as like test, does anyone can understand this namespace is used for which application, which team? No. Some meaningful name we will give. Now, to create our object, to create or update or delete any Kubernetes resource or object, to create or update or delete any Kubernetes resource or object. Even this namespace also, can I call it as one Kubernetes resource or object? Yes. So to create any Kubernetes resource or object, we can use kubectl. What is that kubectl? That is CLI. Create, update, delete, read. CLI. Now there are two ways within CLI. One is we can do this in two ways. One is declarative approach, declarative approach. Another one is imperative approach. Guys, this also sometimes asked in the interview, declarative and imperative. Imperative in the sense, imperative in the sense, imperative in the sense using commands, directly command imperatively. Declarative in the sense we can declare and apply, we can declare or define, we can declare or define, then we can declare or define, we can declare and apply, I mean to say create or update or delete, create or update or delete in the form of manifest file, in the form of manifest file, in the form of files, declarative approach, in the form of manifest files. What is that manifest file? We call it as a Kubernetes manifest files. In the form of manifest file, we call it as a Kubernetes manifest files. So that manifest files we will return in the form of which one? This manifest files we will write in the form of which one? In the form of YAML. Now, I am not talking about administration as of now. Srinivas is asking, as a normal user, will I able to create namespace, delete namespace? That I will come to later. That is administration part. As of now, as I already told, this kubectl is it configured with root certificate, root user certificates, root credentials? Since he is a root credential, since we are using root credential, am I able to do anything in the Kubernetes? Kind of admin. He is an admin for Kubernetes. Am I able to do anything? Because that is a root user, right? I'm using root user credentials, that admin conf file. Did I use that admin conf file as a kubeconfig file here? So since he is an admin conf file, am I able to do anything or everything here in this cluster using that kubectl? Again, Mauta is saying no. Since admin, I am using admin certificates. Since that admin is able to do anything in this Kubernetes cluster, yes. But how to do that authentication and authorization? There is a separate concept called RBAC. Today only I was covering RBAC. At the end of the doc Kubernetes, almost this RBAC will come to picture when I will explain this RBAC. Once you are familiar with all the concepts, without familiar with what is this, what is this, what is this, if I directly explain RBAC, you will not understand. So this RBAC is basically role-based access control. This I will explain at the last. Almost after 20 classes, you will get this RBAC concept. I will explain this RBAC at last. Like a IAM in AWS. In IAM, in AWS, do you have a concept of IAM to manage access to the AWS resources? Using IAM, are you controlling who can do what in AWS? Similarly, do I have some concept in Kubernetes for defining who can do what within my Kubernetes cluster? In Kubernetes cluster, also, there is a concept called authentication and authorization that I can control using RBAC, role-based access control in Kubernetes. That I will explain later. For now, don't worry all these things. Okay. Now, as I told, to create any object like a namespace, deployment, pod, service, anything, I can communicate using CLI with API server. There are two ways we can do. One is imperative, another one is declarative. What is the meaning of imperative? Can I call this as an imperative command? Can I call this as an imperative command? kubectl create namespace, the test. Now, instead of doing this imperative way, can I do it in a declarative way by defining that what type of object I want to create in the form of YML, Kubernetes manifest file, YML. Sometimes in the interview, they are asking this question also. Does Kubernetes supports JSON files also? Instead of YML files, does Kubernetes supports JSON files also? Yes. But 99.9999% we are going to use which files to define the Kubernetes resources? YML files. Okay. Now, if it is a declarative, it is in the form of YML. You have something like this. YML kind metadata spec. So this specification will vary based on what kind of Kubernetes resource you are creating. Suppose I don't want to do this way. Imperatively, I don't want to create a namespace like this. I don't want to create a namespace like this. kubectl create namespace. I'm just giving namespace like this. Test-ns. Just a naming standard. I am using -ns. What is -ns stands for? Namespace. It is not mandatory, but a kind of a naming conventions. I can create like this also, or like this also, that naming convention. Now, is this the namespace name now? Test-ns will be the namespace name now. Yes. If I don't want to do this way, can I do it in a declarative way in the form of YML? Now, in the YML, you have these attributes, these root attributes: API version, kind, metadata, spec. Kind, what kind of object you want to create? Can I call all these things as a Kubernetes objects or resources or APIs? Kubernetes has lot of APIs. You can execute this command, kubectl API resources. Can I call all these as Kubernetes API resources or objects or workloads? Whatever I see here, all these things are Kubernetes I can see those resources, API resources, by executing this command, kubectl API resources. All these things are API resources. To create any of these API resources or objects, can I use declarative or imperative? Yes. But which one will be widely used, imperative or declarative? Declarative in the form of YML. Now, if I see kubectl API resources, I can see all the API resources. Can I see one API resource called namespace? The kind. Kind is what? What kind of resource is this? Kind. Under kind, I can see namespace. Now, if I want to create a namespace, can I say kind as that namespace? In this manifest file, if I want to create that namespace, can I say kind as namespace? Something like this. Guys, if I do something like this, do you think it will work? N small, something like this? No, it is exactly like this. N capital space S small. You see here, kind namespace. Even though if I give like this, if I give like this, do you think will it work? S capital. Will I get error? Will I get a error saying that invalid object or resource? I will get a message from API server saying that invalid object or resource. So kind is namespace. What is the API version for this namespace? Because as I already told, does all these are APIs basically code in the background? Does all these are code in the background? APIs. These APIs are implemented in which programmatic language? These Kubernetes APIs are implemented in which programmatic language? Go language. But do I need to learn Go language to create, update, delete all these objects or APIs? No. We are just using declarative. We are just using declarative. Now, what is the API version for this namespace? Can I see what is the respective API version for that kind by executing this kubectl API resources? Can I see what is the API version? What is the API version for that? V1. V1. I'll create a, I will give that as a V1. Again, is this correct in the YML? Do I need to have a space after this key and value? Do I need to have a space here? I need to have a space. And also sometimes people are doing something like this, capital V1. Is that correct again? No, it's a small V1. It's a small V1. Now, metadata. What is this metadata in general in English? What is metadata? Metadata, is it a data about data? It's a data about data. So under this metadata, can I give something like this? Name. So this name is what? Whatever name I am going to give here, it will be that namespace name. Will it be the namespace name? Whatever I am going to give here, that will be your namespace name. For namespace, you no need to define any specification. Now, there is a concept called labels. There is a concept called labels. In Kubernetes also, can I add a labels to any Kubernetes object, whether I am creating a namespace, whether I am creating a pod, whether I am creating a deployment, whether I am creating a service? Can I add a labels to any of these resources? What is labels? What is labels in general? In the Docker also we discussed about labels. What is labels in general? Does labels are key value pairs? Does labels are key value pairs for uniquely identifying, for uniquely identifying, for identification purpose, uniquely identifying any object? Can I use this labels concept? Can I use any key value pair here? I can give ABC, XYZ also. Can I give like this also? Yes, it won't complain. But am I going to use some meaningful labels for identification purpose? Let's say I am creating this namespace. I am creating this namespace for this team. Can I say something like this? Label team name, let's say product inventory team, something like this. Inventory team, like this. Can I give some labels like this for easy identification purpose? Suppose I can give kind of a contact person also, DL distribution list. But here special characters will not be allowed, guys. You cannot give something like this. If you want to give a DL of the team, product inventory team @tcs.com, you can't give like these special characters. Since you already know in which company you are working, can I just give the DL name without that @tcs.com or @ibm.com, like that? So I can give like this. Now, if any issues are happening in this namespace, by looking at these labels in this namespace, can I contact that respective team using these labels also if required? Can I reach out to the DL if some issues are going on in this namespace? So can I use these kind of labels for identification purpose, for uniquely identifying by giving some meaningful labels? Is it mandatory to give the labels again? Is it mandatory to give the labels again? No. But is it good to have labels for uniquely identifying? Yes. Something like this I can create. Now let me create a namespace like this. Just I am giving just like this, some labels like this. This labels also not mandatory, but if you want to give, you can give a label like this. I am creating a namespace like this, declaratively. Now, if I have this YML, does it mean this will be automatically applied and created if I just create a YML? If I just create a YML, do you think it will be automatically created? No. So do I need to use that YML using kubectl commands? I can use kubectl create or apply that file name. So we have something like this: kubectl create, kubectl update, kubectl delete, like this. Kubectl update, kubectl create, kubectl delete, something like this. Kubectl apply is also there. This is also very, very important question. Sometimes in the interview they are asking, what is the difference between kubectl apply and create? Kubectl create. You can easily guess, guys. You no need to be expert in the any technology or tool. You can understand what is the difference between create and apply. So if I use create, will it just create whatever has been defined in this manifest? Is it going to create this object, whatever I am defining in that manifest? Is it going to create that object in the cluster? If I do something like this, if I say something like this, kubectl create, now this is the resource I have defined. Does namespace will be created? But if with this name already there is a namespace, is it going to throw error saying that the resource already exists with that name? If that is already there, yes. If it is not there, is it going to create? Yes. Now it is there, but I want to update. Maybe I want to update the labels. I want to add one more label. So if it is already there, I want to update. Can I use create command? If it is already there and I want to update, can I use create command to update? Will it work? Now in that case, what command I need to use? If it is already there, I want to update. Can I go with this update command? Can I go with this update command if I want to update? I am trying to execute this update, but that is not there. Will it throw error? I'm trying to execute update command, but this object is not there. Is it going to throw error again? Yes. So this is to create, this is to update. But what is this apply? Is this apply is a combination of create and update? It's kind of a create or update. Create or update. So if I use kubectl apply, if that is not there, is it internally going to create? If I am using kubectl apply, if that object is not there, is it going to create that object in the cluster? Is it going to create that resource in the cluster? Yes. But if it is already there, if it is already there and there are some changes in this file, in this specification there are changes, is it going to update? If it is already there and there are some changes, is it going to update? If it is not there, it is going to create. If it is there, if there are no changes, will I say message saying that configured? I mean to say there are no updates. If there are no changes in this manifest and actual object, I will say something like no changes kind of a message. Already object is there, but there are some changes in this declaration. Is it going to do the update? Is it going to update? Yes. So is it like a create or update? Is this kubectl apply is like a create or update? If it is not there, it will create. If it is already there, if there are any changes, it will get update. Is everyone clear? What is this kubectl create or apply? So that's why most of the cases, whenever you are working, which one you will see, guys? Are you going to see most of the cases this one only, apply only, instead of using create separately or update separately? Most of the cases, do you see apply only like this? Yes. So we can create a namespace like this. Now I will explain the resource quota later. Now I am just creating a namespace, but I have not defined any resource quota for this namespace. Then is there any limit for the number of pods I can deploy in this namespace, number of CPUs, number of memory I can use for applications in this namespace if I don't create a resource quota for now? No. If required, can I define a resource quota also? Maybe I will explain that later, because here itself, if I explain, you will get lot of errors. Your deployments may fail, but because you are not aware about what is that resource quota, Kubernetes will not allow you to deploy more than what you are setting the resource, but you will have a problem troubleshooting because you are completely new to Kubernetes. But in the real time, are you going to define the resource quota while creating a namespace itself? How many pods, how much CPU, how much memory you want to set for that namespace? There is a concept called resource quota. This is also very, very important in the interview perspective also. Not only interview perspective, for working perspective also. Sometimes in the interview, they're asking this question, what is resource quota? Guys, if an interviewer is clever, he will not ask any question straightforward. He will not ask any question straightforward. If the interviewer who is taking the interview is clever guy, he will not ask any question straightforward like this. What is resource quota? What he will not ask, because they know the mentality of the people. They are hard coding this. They're like a by hearting this interview question. They will go to the Google and they will by heart this question, or we are also sharing the interview questions. You are only by hearting that question and answer for that question. But logically, you don't know. Logically, you don't know what is that resource quota, but he will explain. But for what purpose I can use that resource quota? What I am trying to solve the problem? What type of problem I am solving using resource quota? You don't know, but you know the answer. Will that helpful in a working environment? If you know the answer, but what purpose, what use case it will solve? So if the interviewer is more clever, he will not ask a straightforward questions. He will not ask straightforward questions like this. Some guys actually they don't know first of all what is Kubernetes. I too faced that interviews long back. I was giving the interview. The interviewer is going to Google Kubernetes interview questions because that guy also don't know Kubernetes. He was going to Kubernetes interview questions like this. This happened to me in one of the interview. Like he was asking by looking at that Google. That time, even though you don't know Kubernetes, you also went to the same blog what interviewer is asking. Even though you are asked, went through the same page what interviewer is looking, that guy also don't know, you also don't know, you will get a job. But will you able to manage once you go into that actual job? So don't focus only on the interview perspective. Don't focus only on the interview perspective. You can crack the job. You can crack the job if you sit in front of the system and only focus what is Docker interview questions, Kubernetes interview questions without learning also. If I spend 30 days in front of the system by reading all the interview questions of Linux, AWS, Docker, Kubernetes without learning and practicing, you can crack the job. If you are good at communication, you are very good at explaining, you can crack the job. But surviving is difficult. Surviving is difficult. If you don't survive also, you will not have that happiness of the job. You got a job, but you will not have a smile in your face if you don't survive, right? So understand the concept. That's why I'm saying understand the concept. Don't by heart, don't learn stepwise anything. Step one, do this, step two, do this. I can do in any order. If you know the concept, I can come in a reverse way. If you know the concept, instead of doing whatever I supposed to do in step 1, I can do in step 10 also. If you have that way of learning, it will be easy, guys. Now they may not ask directly like this. They will explain, I am sharing my Kubernetes cluster with lot of teams. Now one team is overutilizing their resources. They are deploying lot of pods and other teams are not able to deploy their applications. Then how can you manage the cluster? I don't want one team to fully use my resources of the cluster. They will have these type of questions. You will come, sir, they're asking some real-time question. That is not a real-time question. That is one use case. That is one requirement. So to achieve that requirement, can I use this concept called resource quota, namespaces and resource quota? So interviewer may come differently. If they directly ask what is resource quota, you might have explained. But if they ask in a different way, if you don't understand the concept, you blindly followed running nodes, you blindly executed. Indirectly, if they're asking, you will have a problem clearing the interviews. Even though you know the subject, but you are not able to explain. So learn concept perspective. So now there is a concept called resource quotas. Sometimes in the interviews they are asking this one also directly or indirectly. As I already told, when several teams or users are sharing the Kubernetes cluster with a fixed number of servers, when several users or teams are sharing the cluster with fixed number of servers, which means fixed number of capacity, CPU and memory, do we have a concern that one team can use more than its fair share of their resources? Does one team can use more resources than whatever they deserved? In that case, do we have a concern there? Other teams will run out of the problem. They will run into a problem because they don't have enough CPU and memory in the cluster. So can I use resource quotas concept here as a Kubernetes administrator? As a Kubernetes administrator, can I use a resource quota to address this concern? Does resource quota will provide a constraint or limit? Does resource quota can define, using resource quota, can I define a constraint or limit the aggregate resource consumption per namespace? I can limit the quantity of objects, in the sense number of pods that can be created in that namespace, as well as total amount of compute resources like CPU and memory, how much CPU, how much memory, all the pods, all the containers aggregatively, how much they can take in that namespace. I can define some resource quota like this. How much CPU, how much memory, how many parts like this I can create. How many parts I can create, how many volumes I can create. Also, I can set the limit. Something like this. Something like this, I can create a quota, resource quota. Just to give an example, I am taking like this. Now, while creating a namespace itself, I am creating a resource quota like this. In the same namespace. For this namespace, I am creating a resource quota. Now, if you see here, I don't have this much CPU first of all in my cluster. I am just giving something like this. Now, if I say number of pods as 1, will I able to create more than one pod in this namespace now because of this resource quota? No. If I say number of pods as 2, will I able to create 2 pods? Will I able to create more than 2? More than 2, not allowed. But if I say 10 also, will I able to create 10 pods now? Yes. But does others also comes into picture? All the 10 pods, will it able to take more than aggregation of all those 10 pods? Will it able to go beyond 1 GB of CPU, 1 GB of memory? Now let's say, even though you have given pod limit as 10, let's say one pod itself is requesting 1 CPU and 1 GB. Then even though you have limit as 10 pods, do you able to create another pod, second pod, third pod like that? If that pod itself is taking this much CPU, this much memory? No. So this way, will I able to set the quota of resources for that namespace in the cluster? Does this help administrators? Does this help administrators to manage your cluster more efficiently, organize your cluster more efficiently? Yes. So this I will explain later. Why I am saying explain later? Now I will do something like this. But you don't know, your parts are not going to be created. You will have a lot of problem while practicing. You are trying to deploy your parts will not create because of this quota. First of all, if you don't know, will you able to troubleshoot and identify where exactly went wrong? First of all, you need to understand all these things. So that's why this resource quota I will explain later. That's why I'm saying this resource quota I will explain later, but I have given an idea. But in actual clusters, while creating a namespace itself, are you going to set resource quota? Are you going to work with the team? Suppose this namespace is created for one team. Are you going to ask with the team lead or manager how many parts you are expected to deploy in this namespace? How much CPU, how much memory you are expecting for all your parts? Can you give some details? So based on the communication or based on the discussion with the development team lead or architect, will you set the quota so that they cannot go beyond that? You will sit with the developer lead or architect, you will set up the quota, then they cannot go beyond that. But anytime if they want to additional deployments, I mean to say they want to deploy more pods again, then again, do they need to request administrators, the guys who is managing the cluster for increasing the quota? Again, if they want to deploy more pods sometime, do they need to work with Kubernetes administrators to increase this quota? As an admin, if you don't have enough nodes in your cluster itself, you don't have enough nodes, before you increase the quota, will you add some additional nodes to the cluster, then you will increase the quota? Suppose you don't have those many nodes, that much CPU and memory is not available in your cluster. As an admin, will you add more nodes to your cluster? Then will you increase the quota so that it will not impact any applications, any pods, any namespaces? Is everyone clear how important this namespace and this resource quotas in the actual applications? We are going to use all these concepts in the actual servers case, actual clusters. Now, let me create a namespace only for now. Let me create a namespace only. Now, this is my kubectl machine. Can I have YML like this? Guys, whatever I am doing manually, if I have these YMLs in my version control system, If I have these YMLs in the version control system like SCM, using Jenkins also, will I able to create all these Kubernetes resources automatically using pipelines again? If I have all these YMLs, whatever I want to create or deploy in Kubernetes, if I have these YMLs as part of my SCM tool, using Jenkins also will I able to automatically create, update, delete all these Kubernetes resources using pipelines automation? Yes. Now I am manually doing. So can I execute something like this kubectl apply -f, that file name? I am using apply. So since this is not there, did I got a message saying that created namespace testns is created? Again, if I am executing, is it saying unchanged? Because it is already there, there are no changes here. In this manifest, there are no changes here, unchanged. But if I use create, will it throw error? If I use create, will it throw error? Since it is already there, is it saying this namespace already exists? Now, if I want to do any modifications, can I do something like this? If I want to add some additional labels like this. Now, if I use create now, will it work? No. I need to use update. But instead of using create or update, can I use apply? Now there is a change with the desired state and current state. Do I have some changes in the desired state? This is my desired state. Current state is whatever you already have in the cluster. Whatever you already have in the cluster is current state. This is my desired state. Since there is a change in the desired state and current state, now is Kubernetes is again match with the desired state. Is that updated now? Now, if I want to see, now can I execute kubectl get ns? Can I see that namespace created 78 seconds ago? Now, if I want to see more details, can I use something like this kubectl describe command? The way you have a Docker inspect command here, can I use kubectl describe command? What you want to describe? What object? I want to describe namespace object. Which namespace? This namespace. Can I see more details like this? Now you can see in the YML format also, -o YAML. You can see in the YML format also. But for seeing in the YML format, you should not use describe. You have to use get. Get namespace, that namespace name -o YML. Now can I see that in a YML format? Can I see what labels, whatever has been added like that? Now if you see, when I'm describing that namespace, is it saying no resource quota, no limit range defined for that namespace? What is resource quota I have explained. What is this limit range also I will explain later. What is this limit range I will explain later. Okay. For now, there is no resource quota, there is no limit range. Now if required, as of now, do I have any applications deployed in that namespace? Not only in this namespace, in the default namespace also I have not deployed anything. As of now, we have not deployed any application. We just created a namespace. Guys, if I want to see objects in all the namespaces, can I do something like this? All objects in all namespaces, can I do something like this? -, all namespaces like this. All objects in all namespaces. Can I do something like this? Is it listing all the objects in all the namespaces? As of now, except in cube system, do I have anything in any other namespace? No. In the short form, I can use -a. In the short form, I can use -a. What is that -a also stands for? All namespaces. But if I want to see only pods, can I do something like this also? kubectl get pods, kubectl get deployments, like this also. kubectl get services, like this also. But if you want to see in a specific namespace, can I use -n, that namespace name? If you want to see only services in that namespace, if you want to see only pods in that namespace, you can see like this. As of now, did I deploy any pod in this namespace, whatever we created? No. So today we only discussed about namespace. We have not discussed about what is pod, how to deploy pod. That I will continue in the next class. So what is pod? How to create a pod? First we'll understand the pod. What is single container pod? What is multi-container pod? What is service? Service is also very, very important. What is service in Kubernetes? We'll understand in the next class. So I'm planning to take a class tomorrow also. Is that fine? Because last week also I have taken. If you want to practice Docker and Docker Swarm, I can give you off tomorrow, but don't expect off from every Saturday next week onwards. It's up to you now. If you want to practice till Docker Swarm, I can give you off tomorrow. Otherwise, I can continue tomorrow. If you want to practice, I am giving off tomorrow, but don't expect off from going forward, guys. Next week onwards, there is no holidays on Saturdays. Only this week, holiday I am giving. But practice, man. I can give off, but you need to utilize that off. You are saying I will practice, sir, but you are going for a movies or outside. You are going for movies or you are roaming around on the roads. That will not help. Okay, guys, utilize these sessions. I am trying to explain at a very basic level. I'm starting with very basics, like I'm making you to sit and write ABCDs. Then I am trying to make a sentences. Then I am trying to make kind of a whole pages or paragraphs like that. I am explaining from very basics to advanced level so that you can easily remember and work. You don't need any proxy. You don't need any support for interview or work also. But you need to attend all the classes, you need to practice, you need to utilize this opportunity. Otherwise, without practicing, it is not possible to understand any concept. You will say Balaji sir is teaching some Chinese language. You will feel like that if you don't understand, if you don't attend, if you don't practice a lot. Guys, practice makes man perfect. I am not saying this word. This is there from ages. Not only in IT field, any field you are there. You are doing farming or you are doing some learning. I mean to say, you are doing farming or you are learning some vehicle like a driving, you are learning. Does practice makes you perfect? Same applies here also. In the software, in the IT. How much you practice while learning any technology or any tool, you will be expert in that. So when you are practicing, I am here to help you. You are getting some issues, you are getting some errors. As a trainer, I am available for you in this batch so that I can assist you. But once your batch is done, you are going to start practicing after 6 months of your course. Then you will also not have an interest if you get some error. And also, do you get my time after completing your course? Will I be dedicatedly available for your batch the way I am available now? No, right? I will be busy with my trainings, my work. I may not spend with you the time I am spending now. So you need to do everything in the right time. For everything there is a time. Even though you are doing the task, but you are not doing in the right time, in the right age, I can say right age or right time, again you can't succeed in any area. You have to do whatever you are doing in the right time, right place, with right persons. Then only you can become successful. You guys are not practicing. After 7-8 months you will open your this material. Will you able to remember anything? Even though I explained full paragraph sentences also from ABCs, will you able to remember after 7-8 months if you start opening and practicing? No. So do it in the right time when I am available here so that you can easily understand. And also there is a lot of support from the team also. Nowadays you are posting some issues in the Skype group. Before I respond, Does already others are giving the solutions because they already know, they already practiced a lot on that subject? Already your friends only, I mean to say your batchmates only, are they giving a solution before I respond? But if you do it after 8 months, does others also will respond? Forget about me. Does other your batchmates also will look into that messages and respond? No. So try to do it in the right time. Guys, I am explaining lot of theory. I am explaining problem, I am explaining theory, then I am explaining the concept. But if you want to practice whatever I am discussing, do you need 2 hours or 4 hours of time every day to practice that concept if you are up to date? Not required. You can just hardly spend 1 or 2 hours. But if you want to do multiple times, you need to spend some time. So recordings are available, material is available. Spend at least minimum, if you are working employee, spend minimum 2 hours for practicing. But if you are not working employee, you are striving for the job, software job, you are looking, or you are, striving for the job, then can you spend at least 5 hours, 10 hours, even 12 hours also? If you want to become successful, yes. But the people who are already in jobs, they might be joined only for enhancing. They are not looking for a job, they are only joined for enhancing. They want to enhance their technologies or tools to get a better opportunities. But the guys who don't have a job, do they need to put more effort? Don't compare with others who are already in job, because they joined for enhancing. Then their job, they are already having a job. But the guys who don't have a job spend lot of time. I see reverse nowadays. Actually, the guys who already has a job is practicing a lot, attending the classes. The guys who don't have a job, not at all attending the classes. Reverse I am observing. These are my suggestions, guys. These are my suggestions. As a, you can treat me as a brother or mentor, whatever it is, or a trainer. I'm giving a suggestions, but it's up to you whether you want to follow. If you follow, at least you will get benefited. Otherwise, there is of no use. Thank you, guys. That's it for today. Lot of Bodha also, lot of Bhagavad Gita also not good for everyone. Have a great weekend. Come back with full energy. From Monday, we'll start discussing about actual Kubernetes. Okay. Thank you. We'll see you on Monday.